Denis.
Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet wrapped in a pandemic. Sadly, still, I got my third booster today, which is the gift of living in a rich country like the United States that has, like so many developed countries, not done enough to expand vaccine availability in poor parts of the world, like Madagascar, like so many countries where there are very few doses of vaccine that have been distributed. The pandemic is one of the unfolding catastrophes, and climate change has been unfolding for decades, as I've been reporting since 1988. And yet, there are some misinterpretations that are damaging, I think, our capacity to reduce the impact of climate, the worst effects of climate system on communities. If we focus too much on climate change, the warming of the global climate, we miss these factors on the ground that are devastating communities routinely because of their lack of capacity to deal with climate impacts and all the other factors that disrupt life. This is the Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast, and today we're focusing on a familiar theme, climate vulnerability, and the importance of addressing it and identifying it and putting it in the foreground, even as we fight the big fight on climate change. I have some wonderful guests here you'll meet in a minute. I'm going to start with a clip from a very good journalist, David Muir at ABC News, who back in October was reporting a story that ran as the COP26 Glasgow climate negotiations got underway November 1st. And listen to what he says here about Madagascar, where a terrible drought is afflicting the southern end of the world's fifth largest island.
We're going to turn now to the ABC News exclusive, Inside Madagascar. Tonight, the UN warning of that first famine driven entirely by climate change. We have covered hunger and famine for many years on this broadcast, but so often conflict, war, terror are the driving forces behind it. But tonight, the UN says this is climate. More than 1 million people facing hunger and starvation in southern Madagascar. And we boarded a small plane with the World Food Program to get to the south. And what we witnessed when we got there.
We are allowed on board one of the only flights.
I'm going to stop it there and have our guests start to weigh in. You'll understand some of the issues behind the way that was framed. And as a journalist, words like framing, I never really thought about them as a journalist very much. You need to write the news. But framing really matters. How you actually, what do you put in the foreground? How do you shape a message? And you'll see in a minute, we'll talk through this issue of Madagascar, what's actually happening on the ground. And we'll hear from someone on the ground in Madagascar. What do we know about the climate impact, climate change, what's happening in the climate system? We'll hear that from Martin van Alst. What's happening in the social systems or not happening? And we'll talk to Lisa Schipper and Dan Osgood about those aspects of this as well. So it's great to have you all here this morning. And how are you doing, first of all? Maybe we'll start with Denis in Madagascar. Let me unmute your microphone, or maybe it already is. Can you introduce yourself, Denis? Whoop. You have to unmute, actually. I muted you, so click it again.
Okay. Good. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. My name is Denis Bari. I'm the operations coordinator for International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent, based in Madagascar, covering Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, and Mauritius. And now, since we are talking about Madagascar, the current situation now in Madagascar is that we know that more than 1 million population in the south of Madagascar are being affected by the drought. And this is a prolonged drought for at least 3 years, consecutive severe drought. And we can see people really lacking food, lacking water, lacking medical assistance, a lot of children with acute, moderate, or severe malnutrition, lack of water for basic needs, water for animals, everything. But also having different indirect consequences, like the school dropouts, like violence in households, like the child abuse, even some issue of insecurity in some areas. So it is really alarming. We cannot say that all this is caused by the climate change, but we can, that a risk times vulnerability becomes a disaster. So the vulnerability was there, then climate change came just to add or to reinforce the vulnerability of different communities. So that is how the situation is right now, and we will continue to discuss about it. Thanks.
That's great. And Martin van Aalst, can you just introduce your affiliation and the like, and mention? I just want to mention that you are one of the authors of this new report that's trying to kind of get at the role of climate change, which is the change in climate forced by human activities, and climate variability, which is the inherent noise within the climate system.
Yes, thanks, and a pleasure to be discussing this recent research where we looked into this particular famine in Madagascar in more detail to try and answer that question that so many people are asking. So is this climate change? And the reason I'm getting that question is that I'm director of the International Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a reference center for the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement and its partners. So we answer questions, for instance, from Madagascar Red Cross in this case, but also from the international system, and for instance, also the donors supporting more and more humanitarian relief operations. And they're asking the question, so is that what we should be expecting more of? I'm also a professor of climate and disaster resilience at the University of Twente, and in that capacity also contributing to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as you were hinting, we're just working on the last little bits now of the summary for policymakers that is being discussed with governments in February, of the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC 6th assessment report. And that's the 6th installment of these sort of once every 7-year big reports. And Working Group 2 is in particular dealing with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So the question of what do we already see today, and that question came up in Madagascar, but also what do we expect in the future, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, and you and Lisa Schipper are both involved in the frenzied but careful work of the Working Group 2 IPCC report, which is coming out. It's the next one coming out, right? Lisa, can you just quickly chime in on this report always gets second billing? You have the science report came out earlier this year. Everyone, lots of media coverage, and here's the one on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities. And it feels to me like the most important of, well, they're all important, but just give us a sense of what that means, and then thinking about Madagascar's plight in that context.
Yeah, absolutely, Andy. So yeah, I mean, as Martin said, this is the 6th assessment report. So the IPCC has these 3 working groups, and the Science of Climate was released in August this year, and the second, the Working Group 2 report will be out in February, and the Working Group 3 report about 4 weeks after that. And so, yeah, I think Working Group 2 in some ways is where a lot of these issues that link between climate and society come up in a way that Working Group 1 report obviously doesn't, because it's dealing with the climate science. And that's I think I would say it's probably the most complicated in that sense, because we're trying to understand a lot of things around human behavior, and humans are really difficult to understand. So we also have, bring in perspectives from lots of different disciplines as well. And
Right.
we're also a very diverse group. So we do have a pretty decent representation of authors from the Global South as well. So I think we have a lot of diversity in the perspectives and the scientific approaches and so on. And that creates a lot of discussion. But that report is, I think, in particular, the Working Group 2 and the Working Group 3 reports. Working Group 3 is on mitigation. Those are the reports where we're also looking at assessing solutions. So what do we know about adapting to climate change? What seem to be the things that seem to work? Similarly about mitigation. And that is why I think we can see at the end which one of these reports is the most important. But of course, taken together, they provide a really comprehensive overview of what we understand on climate change at this point. So yeah.
Great. And Dan, your institute is actually named. The words climate and society are in there. IRI. It's the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. So it's implicitly about the interface. When you think about the news as it was conveyed around Madagascar, the last couple of months, and now there are these pieces based on this report saying, no, it's not attributable to global warming. And society is sitting here thinking, what do we do about Madagascar? What comes to your mind? What does this feel like?
Yeah, exactly. First thing that comes to my mind is that I need to unmute. You'd think that over the past year I would have learned how to do that, but no. So thanks. Thanks for having me here. And I'm the lead of the financial instruments sector team at the International Research Institute for Climate Society at Columbia, and I lead a team where folks who are working in Madagascar on my team, Suha and Johanna, I want to give them credit. And I think what you were talking about, the framing and the messaging and the takeaways, they seem to have so much power that goes beyond. They become these sentient entities that you have to scold like children to keep them from going in a crazy direction. They have so much more power than the findings that are actually in the report. And I think it is this point that you bring up is like, is it climate change or not? Is we get onto that point. And, I'm very excited about how my awesome team works together as a team. And I think one of the things that I want to really highlight is that climate change and the ways climate change impacts people work really well as a team. And it's not one thing or the other. And I also want to highlight that climate is not 5 degrees 50 years from now, which apparently is that way. I move my arms when I talk. Climate is everything from weather that happens on day to day, going towards weeks, to variation, year to year droughts, and to long-term trends, to things that happen over decades that go back and forth. And it's always a mix of, things that are our fault, anthropogenic, and natural processes. And just because we're not responsible for everything doesn't mean that we're not responsible for any of it, because they work together as a team. And, I'm looking, it's as winter falls, the days are getting shorter and the nights are getting colder. And this messaging of, is it climate change or not, is like saying, we can't talk about winter nights getting longer and colder, because winter would happen. Nights would happen even without winter. And I think there's ways where we can be less binary on the way that we talk about climate and its impacts on people, that more accurately reflect the findings of our reports. I think it's never exclusively something. And I think that we need to keep that in mind, and that saying it's not exclusively climate change doesn't mean that climate change isn't driving things. You know, Eddie Van Halen, I guess I'm saying exactly what generation I am. He makes very small, you know, noises on his strings, and his amplifiers make his massive music. We wouldn't say that the amplifiers are actually doing the music and Eddie Van Halen isn't. So I think that's something that we need to think about in terms of how we think about these things and how we talk about these things.
Let's go. We're going to go back to Denis in Madagascar in a minute, but I wanted to get Lisa to come in here because she and I have both been very actively pushing on this question of how to think more constructively about the mix of climate change and vulnerability change. And over on Twitter, at least, and I think we're trying to write a piece together going forward. This comes up, and there's a simple. Nothing is simple in this arena, but there's a path forward. But how do you articulate it? And then I'll articulate what I'm thinking.
So yeah, thanks, Andy. So I should say, I mean, I didn't really introduce myself also, but I'm a research fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and my research is and has been for the last 2 decades looking at the links between adaptation to climate change and development. And as part of this, I've been very much looking at what we call kind of the root causes of vulnerability. Because when you look at the links between adaptation and development, you inevitably have to ask sort of, and early on especially, we're asking like, what is development? What kind of actions are development? And what kind of actions are adaptation? And especially in the context in the Global South and places where people's sort of daily activity is not necessarily so well adapted to climate variability even. The question is sort of, you know, is it sufficient to kind of improve development in some places? And will that address the issues that we need in order to be able to deal with kind of climate change as well? And so this debate has gone on for a long time in different ways. But one of the things that falls between the cracks, if we only think about adaptation strategies, is the role of vulnerability, and in particular, the sort of these really deep root causes. And maybe I'll just quickly share, because I think this, I hope I can share my
If you hit share,
screen.
it pops into a thing where then I share it. So let's
okay, so I'm going to try to share. I'm sharing this is what I want to share. If you can see that.
Yep, I see it. So hold on one second. It's like a two-part process here. Okay. There we go.
So Denis already referred to some extent to this, the pressure and release model, actually. And I just use this one because it's nice and colorful. But this I think it just shows very nicely that the root causes of vulnerability are not things that are necessarily influenced by the hazard, and that we have to understand that there's sort of very deep things that have to do with the way that people are marginalized because of their religious belief or their political beliefs, and that these influence kind of the power that they have in decision making. That then influences dynamic pressures, like, you know, if they're marginalized, there maybe won't be any local institutions to support them that are placed in their area, because these are people who are seen maybe from the central government. We're not going to care about those people. And then you end up in these unsafe conditions where you don't get the institutional support that you need, you don't maybe get the early warning that you might need, and so on. And then a hazard comes along, and then it creates this risk. And if it's really extreme, in both cases, it would be a disaster. And I think I'm just using this because I think it's very nicely illustrates how deep these roots lie. And what I worry about is the way that in disaster risk studies, we have, there was a huge push in the 1970s and 1980s to get governments to understand that vulnerability is part of the reason why there are these disasters. And it's not just about the hazards. Part of this comes in the campaign, No Natural Disasters, for example. But what I worry about is that now we're seeing kind of as climate has become more and more important on the political agenda, it has taken over and kind of said, oh, here's climate change. It's also now the cause of all of these problems. And as I think Daniel said nicely, it's not, we can't say, you know, we shouldn't be black and white about it in the sense that it's not either or, but we need to recognize that risk is caused by multiple layers of things. And certainly the root causes could be affected by climate change. And in Madagascar, maybe, and Denis might comment on this, 3 years of drought can lead to increased sort of exacerbated root causes. So that can kind of, it comes in from different angles. But this is kind of the, so I guess the bottom line is that we need to be cautious of rhetoric that suggests these simple solutions or also simple explanations, because that then leads to not only the wrong kind of policy making, but also potentially things being, events being attributed to something that, you know, and so that governments say, oh, it's climate change. And especially if you're in the global south and you feel like you haven't contributed to greenhouse gas emissions, you might say, oh, that's coming from the global north, and so we're not responsible for it. But actually what might be underlying is bad planning, corruption, other kinds of problems that are actually making people vulnerable. So even if the event is minor, there will be a huge disaster.
Well, you know, you brought up something important, and I want to ask this question of Dan, and also get Martin to weigh in, and then we'll go to Denis with the specific context. In covering COP26, one of the pressure points that seems to be rising is that the West, the rich countries, are now cutting off finance for fossil fuel development, including in Africa, potentially. And one of the sources of resilience in a community is access to energy. So sometimes climate policy does not align with resilience policy. And there are many African countries, especially those with fossil resources, who have zero historic contribution to climate change, are pushing back. And I see this as a journalist as a really intensifying problem. So I guess my question is, sometimes the climate solutions are not aligned with climate risk reduction. Does that feel plausible?
So I think the thing is that we do need to think. We tend to think about things in a backward way. I guess that's, at least I do. It's my natural programming, and I think what's happening is we really need to be thinking about climate change adaptation as saying, how does vulnerability and risk multiply climate impacts or cause climate impacts? And it's not, you know, it's not about saying we're going to focus on exclusively from the perspective of how do fossil fuels change what the temperature is 50 years from now. Mm-hmm. And it's really about saying, and it is, this is, you know, deep in the IPCC like language. This is at the core, but we need to remember that you have to start with, how does vulnerability and risk lead to impacts from climate change? And adaptation and response to climate change needs to be framing it in terms of those problems. It's you know, what happens is the climate is on average, you know, if you're getting hotter and drier, or if you're just getting hotter and crops need more water, it's making the edge change, but it's these year-to-year things that bump you over the edge. So a year-to-year drought is what bumps you over the edge. And if you're already got a head start or a boost because of long-term trends, you need to be thinking about that. Vulnerability is, you know, that you have an edge to fall off of. So if you're going to address climate change, you need to be starting with vulnerability and risk and thinking about how climate change poisons that system. And I think having a focus on having developing countries reduce their fossil fuel use may not be the place where you get the biggest bang for your buck. I think there's other places where we're much where we use a lot of fossil fuel and where the reductions could be much more impactful. But it's one of these things where it's not that vulnerability is not related to climate change. It's that vulnerability is the amplifier, and that is the place, vulnerability and risk. And I'm saying this as someone who works on reducing vulnerability and risk in Madagascar in order to help adapt to climate change. And we need to remember that's the kind of framing. And I need to keep my head on it. And I think as a society, that's what we need to remember.
Well, let's go to Denis and then Martin. Sorry, Martin, because Denis is on the ground in Madagascar. Denis, do you feel the world has the picture straight, or is the picture complicated unnecessarily? What does Madagascar really need on the ground? Oh, sorry, you have to unmute. Let me help.
Great. Yeah, thank you. The real context in Madagascar, when we try to balance previous vulnerability and climate change, is that the south of Madagascar is a region that has been for a long time hit by different disasters, including drought. Even in 90s, this could happen, and now it is also a zone which is underdeveloped, considering to other areas of the country, with less infrastructures, with inaccessible areas. Some areas we don't have roads. Some areas maybe there are no health centers, schools, etc. And this is worsen the situation, because the zone is, we can say that more than 80% depending on agriculture. So if they miss agriculture, nothing else they can have a sustainable livelihood. This is one of the things that, and also something else is that this adaptation that we are talking about, for example, if we look at the current situation, we are in emergency situation. I agree with you that yeah, we have to think about adaptation, about development. Development maybe have to start at the same stage of emergency response. But how will you really convince someone whose children have not eaten for some days, and you start talking about long-term solution while he doesn't have even something to eat that same day? That is some of the challenges that we are facing, even the other humanitarian actors, even the government itself. But I think it has to. We have to start now thinking about it and really assess the real causes and start involving even the communities themselves and see how we can progress together for resilience or midterm development. Thank you.
Thank you. And Martin, to you again, thank you for your patience. Let's talk a little bit about the attribution process. I think this, of the attribution exercises I've seen so far, and this is the World Weather Attribution Project, which I guess partnered with you for this one. This is the most I've seen where they reflect the social components and the geographic components and not just climate change. I've been making the case on Twitter, and I'll be writing about this, that I'm all for climate change attribution exercises as long as they come with an impact attribution exercise as well. In other words, yes, it's fine to know what portion of a storm probabilistically might have contributed to harm, but let's look at the harm itself. What are the drivers of that? And so I was encouraged to see this one, and it did result in sort of a different landscape of media coverage. So can you talk about that process? You know, what do you think? Do you think we're getting that right in terms of making sure we talk not just about what's changing in the weather, but what's changing in how society is girded for that?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think the science is actually acknowledging this since at least a decade. Lisa and I also worked together on the IPCC special report on extremes that was very explicit that we have hazard, exposure, and vulnerability together to create risk, both to explain current impacts, where actually exposure and vulnerability were the main drivers explaining the trends that we saw so far. Climate was starting to weigh into it, but often difficult to get out of the noise because there's so many factors at play at once. And I think Denis just also showed how even consecutive disasters, one after the other, and I think that's one of the big messages of the AR6 compared to the AR5, the recognition that actually the biggest problems often come when it's one thing on top of the other. And what was interesting in the Madagascar study is also the compounding impacts of COVID. So people losing their livelihoods.
Exactly.
And therefore being hit harder by the drought. So it's always, and one of the concerns with climate change is also that if these cycles aggravate, people actually don't build up their resilience, but they're drawn further down. Now, in the case of world weather attribution, so we were part of that consortium from the very start. So we've done many of these studies, and actually, though the media attention is often for just the climate change hazard signal, our standard protocol, which is also part of every study that we've done, includes a component on vulnerability and exposure. And for instance, in 2015, we did a study of a drought in Sao Paulo, where the mayor and the governor were both already blaming the West and climate change for the problems with water rationing looming for both poorer and more well-off neighborhoods in Sao Paulo. And we did an attribution study where it turned out there was not much of a trend in the drought incidents, but of course, a massively expanded urban population, and a massive increase in per capita water use without a commensurate upgrade in water supply systems. So, you know, that's another case where the vulnerability was actually the main driver of the problem at that point.
Right.
I would say that regardless of whether there is a strong climate signal, like, you know, with the Canadian heat wave, where we saw that heat wave would not have happened without climate change, that is clearly a case where the climate signal does matter for what is affecting people now, but also how you should prepare. The same are International Red Cross figures. European heat waves, the last 2 years, were the most deadly disaster in our global statistics. So even rich countries are getting new disasters that they need to do other things for. But then again, there you need to analyze who's at risk, you know, and for instance, the elderly population, the growing elderly population in those places also makes us more vulnerable. In South Asian cities, it is people that have to work outside during midday that are particularly vulnerable. So then you focus on that. The city of The Hague recently, so in my own home country, the Netherlands, did an analysis of their resilience to heat and did a heat risk map of the city, where initially they started with a hazard map. And it turned out the heat hotspot coincided with the poorest neighborhoods, which also turned out to have the highest population of immigrants with the highest pre-existing disease conditions, with the lowest Dutch as a first language skills, so public messaging wouldn't reach them as well. So initially, people thought about urban greening, and so it turned out there were urban greening subsidies, but they were all going to the suburbs, and none of them were actually going to these inner city neighborhoods. And in the end, it was a social director mandate to start doing something about heat risk in that part of the city where it ended up. And I think that's very telling, and it shows that even in cases where climate is the main driver, you need to look at all these facets of risk to be able to get the right diagnosis of where to start solving the problem. I also wanted to come back very quickly, if I may, to your earlier question about the energy transition, because I think even though in some cases climate is a minor or even an insignificant factor, like in Madagascar, in some cases it is a big factor, we're also seeing more and more clearly that it is becoming a bigger driver of problems in the world. So we do need that energy transition. And you know, that's a collective exercise that we all need to do. But your question about how the responses, in this case, greenhouse gas reductions, but in some cases also deliberate efforts to adapt, how they're affecting vulnerability is a very important question. I think a South African example, trying to reduce coal use in South Africa, but at the same time investing in new livelihoods for mining families, for instance, there is an example of where we're at least trying to make that puzzle. We've also seen cases in West Africa, for instance, where cities were starting to protect the central business district with hard coastal protection. And actually, it was destabilizing, or at least at risk of destabilizing, sandbanks further down, where actually the most vulnerable communities, where we have had our humanitarian response operations, even in the current climate, were taking place. They would be worse off with that coastal protection of the central business district. So you need holistic solutions in this case, looking at an entire landscape, but particularly also focusing on people that live in those vulnerable places, typically because they haven't had a say, because they don't have the financial means to live in safer areas of the city, because they need to go to that city to earn a livelihood, but can't afford to live anywhere else. So these patterns appear everywhere. And even if there is a very strong signal of sea level rise, a plain solution won't get you there. And so that's true for greenhouse gas mitigation. It's true for adaptation. Basically, what you need to do is good development, taking account of our whole set of objectives in the world, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also reducing inequalities.
And can I just connect to this a little bit? I think there's a challenge. This is maybe actually a question for you, Andy. As Martin talks about the long-term climate change component not being significant in Madagascar, he's talking about it as in the paper, it's I believe a statistical term. I think what climate change and climate are playing an important role in people being impacted by things like not having enough food in Madagascar. It's may not be the dominant player, but it is part of what's boosting people to fall over the edge. And what I'm wondering, the paper itself does see, if I'm right, that there are climate change trends, and that there may be some different things directly related to climate going on. And when we work on risk, and we do the modeling for insurance or the use of forecasts for triggering things, we do see these, and they are important factors that we need to take into consideration that do drive meaningful problems as they interact with year-to-year variability, which may be changing with climate, or it may just be, amplifying climate. And then the way that we address and all of these problems, including the climate change part, is by saying, let's look at the things that we can change. And the things we can change are usually these vulnerability issues. We can address those, and those will help us keep from having these climate problems, as well as other problems, which, hopefully it's okay to solve two problems at the same time. And then also we can better manage risk through things like insurance, if we do a responsible job of it, and the use of forecasts in preparedness. Is there a way in communicating things through media, is there a way to make this clear, instead of having it be, it's either climate, where we're talking about 5 degrees 50 years from now, or vulnerability that has nothing to do with climate, and therefore anything you do with vulnerability is not legitimate in a climate conversation. And I think vulnerability is extremely legitimate in a climate conversation, including in Madagascar, including related to these past years. And that's, I believe, what's in the paper that Martin's an author on. And according to my read, but I think we end up, by the time there's a message that sort of takes its own, we get this very binary, artificial dichotomy. Is there a way that we can talk or work with media as we do these studies to be responsible about what was the dominant thing we saw statistically, and what are the things that we need to do, and that kind of thing?
I can't wait to hear Lisa's reaction to what Martin was saying a minute ago and what you've been broaching. To me, as a journalist, again, I've been on this beat since 1988, and I think I made a big mistake. I don't think it was I couldn't know it was a mistake at the time. But my coverage from 1988 was always biased toward climate. as opposed to toward risk. And one of the most valuable things that I've ever heard in a conversation with a source came from Diana Leverman, who I know you all know. I'm going to play it here because it's just like so, it nails the solution, I think. Not a solution, there's no solution. But it really identifies a path forward. And hopefully you can hear this. I think I've got it queued up correctly. We were having a conversation about vulnerability. It was with Lawrence Bauer also. And I showed this slide that I taught when I talk to journalists. Sometimes I say, if we put risk, our beat should be climate risk, not climate change. And climate change is one driver of risk. But here you go. Listen to Diana here.
When we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, oh, it's the probability of a heat wave. But we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm.
The probability of harm.
In addition to sort of population growth and other factors, poverty is massively important in explaining vulnerability. And we see a lot of parts of the world, even though we've brought millions of people out of poverty, that there are parts of the world where aspects of poverty make people very vulnerable. So if you're a poor person, yeah, exactly, great example. But the work we've done in Mexico and in other regions shows that if you're poor and they privatize your water, it makes you more vulnerable. If you're an indigenous community and somebody steals your land, you're vulnerable. There are so many ways in which addressing basic social welfare can reduce vulnerability, whether it's in New Orleans or Mexico City. So, and we're seeing that right now with the heat wave here. It's the poor who can't afford to pay for air conditioning, who can't afford to insulate their homes, and who are living on the streets or working in outdoors occupations in 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
So that just blew my mind, because it was such a clear, beautiful articulation of when you put vulnerability, the vulnerability side of risk in the foreground, this landscape of solutions comes. And as Martin was saying, this is in rich countries as well as poor countries. The heat, Christy Ebby, another IPCC author on here, she said very simply, she said, nobody needs to die in a heat wave.
Exactly. Yeah. No, she worked with us on the Canada heat wave example, for instance, where we again made that same point. But it is. Heat waves all those impacts are preventable if you are aware that risk exists, right? So what is happening on the hazard side is not insignificant, not meaningless. But in order to do something with it, you need to understand risk, and that means also understanding hazard, and especially also exposure, and especially vulnerability of those people and assets that are exposed.
Yeah. And by the way, this is for all of you. I think I first mentioned this on Twitter years ago. In retrospect, I wonder if we would have been better off with an intergovernmental panel on climate risk.
Oh yeah, and I mean that's part of the problem, right? So I think the IPCC has actually moved on, but the climate policy world is still very much in a climate-only silo, and we are about to recreate the problem that we've had with adaptation now in the loss and damage space, where again we're seeing climate impacts materialize because of something in the climate hazard, but actually in places where vulnerability is high. And we're starting to do all these funny incremental cost type reasonings again that we've learned 20 years ago work if you have a seawall. You get 10 centimeters of sea level rise in your projections. You add 10 centimeters of seawall to your existing seawall, and you're back at the same level of safety. That would work for a country like the Netherlands if sea level rise was our only problem. Now, even in a country like the Netherlands, it's a combination with a delta where river runoff is increasing, and then another year there's a drought. So suddenly we need to retain the water. So even there it doesn't work, let alone places like Bangladesh where there's no seawall to start with. So the most effective solution would be a better early warning system. And they have invested in that, and they've saved millions of lives, literally doing so, which we can learn something of in Germany, right? I mean, Bangladesh had a massive super typhoon where only 124 people died, whereas we lost 200 lives in the heart of Europe. because we're not well prepared for stuff that's coming our way. And again, it was, for instance, a house with disabled people where we just didn't have the warning systems functional to get people out of harm's way in time. So I think this is a very universal story, but of course, and that is our humanitarian reality every day. So that's also where I'm happy to see people like Lisa and to some extent myself also representing an international humanitarian network in the IPCC. I think this voice is getting stronger. But it's our daily reality. So it's also frustrating to some extent that in Glasgow, we still see so much of these conversations in that climate silo. Whereas if you're on the ground in these villages in Madagascar, it is so bloody obvious.
Yeah. Here's another, can I ask another question of you? And Lisa, just 30 more seconds. Is part of the bias toward climate in the bias toward emissions and carbon, which are measurable, concrete? So we tend to invest in and think about things that we can measure, and resilience and adaptation and political stability, and the factors contributing to fragility are what do you invest in and where's your outcome. So I think there's levels of bias and there's so much money in clean energy. We're talking about trillions of dollars.
Well, and there is a global versus local dimension, right? So the United States does have an interest in reducing global emissions for what happens to the United States. It doesn't have much of an interest in adaptation in Madagascar necessarily, right? Even though,
unfortunately.
So, and I think increasingly we're seeing, by the way, that premise that we're not connected to the rest of the world is also starting to fall apart, right? I mean, we are facing reduced car production globally due to a range of factors also having to do with COVID and logistics, but also due to droughts in part of Asia where those chips are being produced. So I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that we're not immune to what's happening to the global climate system, even from that perspective. But to first order, CO2 in the atmosphere is something we all have to deal with, whereas adaptation is something that is more local than global. And is partly also a matter of solidarity and humanity, where you need to appeal to a different type of rationale. And we need to be talking about things in a different way.
So Lisa, you've been very patient, and the floor is yours for at least several minutes. I know you've taken notes. How does this feel?
No worries. I mean, I agree with everything that's being said. I think the challenge is, well, I had a couple of thoughts. So first of all, in response to this notion of maybe rethinking the IPCC, if there's anything from my perspective, my background is development studies. So of course, I'm looking at kind of the development perspective and trying to see that I would say an intergovernmental panel on development would be what we really need, because to me, that's what the issues are. It's around making choices. What are the choices that we're making for our future, for our well-being? And these are the medium to long-term issues. And as Denis pointed out, what do you say to somebody who's in the middle of a drought and who has to think, what do I eat tomorrow or next week, if they're lucky? This is, yeah, exactly. It's not something that you can address at that moment. At that moment, you have to think about coping to manage to kind of keep going. And these are things that we need to think about, beforehand. We need to think about them overall as sort of in terms of strategy for development planning. But I wanted to raise the fact that, and in fact, this summer, the UK their House of Parliament has an international development committee where they're looking at questions around development aid from the UK, and one of the conclusions that was reached after a series of witness statements, I was one of the people making a statement there, was that a recommendation to maybe have a Minister of Climate and Development. And I don't think this would ever maybe materialize, but the idea that you would have somebody responsible for thinking about the overlaps between climate change and development very explicitly, because otherwise we have these very siloed approaches. But I wanted to raise something that else has come up is we've done a lot of work with a whole bunch of other people looking at adaptation projects. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these adaptation projects are actually resulting in increased vulnerability. So that's not at all the way we want it to go, right? If we're going to talk about funding for adaptation, we also need to make sure that funding isn't making people worse off. And the thing that I think maybe in response to your question around sort of why are we focused so much on mitigation and not thinking so much or not giving enough space to adaptation and resilience questions is because adaptation is extremely political. It isn't an apolitical kind of tick box exercise, and there is a lot of decisions, judgments involved, including who gets to benefit from adaptation projects, who gets to benefit from something. And there are lots of examples that we looked at, including things where donors come with money and they say, okay, those people who are registered in the National Housing Registry can participate in this project, or there is a project funded by UN agency in Sao Tome and Principe where they said, okay, only people with landowners can participate in this adaptation projects. And of course, we know that probably the most poor, vulnerable people are the landless, so they couldn't benefit from these projects. And I think so. We need to take a critical look at the kinds of things that are also being invested in. Yes, because the risk is that we'll end up with this maladaptation, which is a very important and powerful concept, but we're not so great at being able to identify it until after the fact. So some of us are trying to improve that knowledge. But I guess that's what
I just did a story on domestic issues here now that $1.2 trillion are going to flow for infrastructure. There's a bias toward beach-dwelling billionaires who have the capacity to even seek the money, who have the lawyers and the grant writers. The communities that have more capacity to pursue new funding, and communities that don't are again left out. So even at the scale of the United States, rich country, you see that disparity potentially playing out. Let's have a few more minutes. I'd love to get a last, a next step point from each of you. Denis, what can we do? What can I do as a communicator to help amplify, what solutions would look like in Madagascar? And Martin, what can we do together that we can't do individually? Is there something I can do with a webcast that can get deeper into some of these questions? And the same for Dan. But Denis, what can the world really do? And what can the media do for Madagascar that isn't kind of like that ABC report at the beginning?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, the media can always advocate for the communities. The reality is that communities are suffering. They need food, they need water. Their children are not going to schools. They don't have animals, or all the animals have been sold, or either other animals died due to the drought. And you can, if you bring a topic about climate change to the community, it will be something very large and generic. For him, for someone from the community, what he needs is to show him how tomorrow he can just adapt to this and improve his situation. He has not been growing his crops for some years. Now, how can he improve that situation? He sold all his animals. How now can he improve that livelihood? So there are many other different ways to come up with, now we are encouraging them for restoring income generating activities, just small income generating activities, to see how they can even strengthen their social cohesion, and together they can always think on how they can develop themselves. So the media, something which is very important is to well communicate on the ground context in favor of the beneficiaries, in favor of the communities.
That seems very valuable. Is another way to think about how to divide the media role. You can write a lot about climate change. Activists can post hashtags like climate emergency, but there's a vulnerability emergency. that can be addressed in meaningful, concrete ways by getting to the right organizations or with the right expertise, or putting money where it's needed. Slowing climate change is vital. I've been writing about it forever, half my life, and I'm 65. But it's not going to change the prospects of someone on the ground in southern Madagascar to do that. And that's, I think, something we need to figure out how to work on better. Martin, a last thought from you along these lines too. What can we do together that we can't do individually?
Yeah, well, the first is to tell the whole story. I was happy about the pickup of the Madagascar story. I thought it would be possibly a bit of a dud for global media, given that it did not have a sexy line like this drought would not have happened without climate change or so. Maybe for some it was sexy because we were disagreeing with some of the earlier big words that had been used, which also is not what we intended. But I think a richer conversation about these issues is critical. And then I think a second dimension is having these conversations about how these questions are so intertwined across timelines, right? We're thinking of climate change. Dan said it in the beginning. Climate change is no longer a question for 2050. We're facing these issues now. But even for what we face now, but also what we'll face in 2030, 2040, how we develop and how we deal with inequalities and so makes so much of a difference. So acknowledging these different dimensions, also acknowledging the challenges with that sometimes. I think addressing it everywhere. So I think it's important that you have these discussions also in the United States when these subsidy schemes, that infrastructure plan is coming up, but also that we have it on a global level, given that there is a shared responsibility for what is happening. So I think raising these sorts of examples when stuff comes up, I think on the part of science, I think we need to bring that evidence to the fore. What my center is trying to do is also bring the insights from people like Denis together with the sort of hazard analysis that the climate science folks in the World Weather Attribution can do, so that we do indeed tell that whole story. I think our biggest challenge at the moment is still in that climate change bubble. I mean, there's talk of $100 billion a year now, which we're about to reach. And the question to me is not just, are we reaching the 100 billion, but how are we spending it? And so the first observation that was made in Glasgow already is only 20 billion of that is for adaptation. They now said they'll double it. But it matters more where it is spent and how it is spent. And those questions about quality of finance, there's a growing trend towards locally led adaptation. So actually putting communities more in charge. And there are some mechanisms that are able to do that. But then there's also the associated question of how do you then balance the near-term challenge of feeding your kids tonight with that question of how do you gradually raise resilience? And a lot of that is dealing with pre-existing poverty and frankly also sometimes governance challenges.
Right. Sure.
I think it's going in the right direction. So I'm definitely an optimist on that one. But it's vital that conversation is taking place, and it's not just a question of polar bears in 2100, but it is indeed about Madagascar right now.
Well, that's an incredibly helpful framing, and there's lots to do. I'll be trying to do more briefings with journalists to see if we can get some of that. And building the journalism capacity in places like Madagascar too is really important.
Right. Exactly.
So Dan, a last word.
Yeah, I think what we need to remember in terms of finding solutions is that we in the wealthy countries took the oil and burned it, and took the resources and left people vulnerable in the less wealthy countries. And I think the solutions really are about understanding that and figuring out how to reverse engineer that to solve it. And I think some of the most exciting things I've seen is finding ways to have the voices of the farmers and the local regional experts who usually have very good practical solutions, have those directly informing the way we solve our these climate problems. And remembering that these pieces come together and they interact, and it's not climate or vulnerability. They're very intimately connected.
That's great to hear, and that's something I can definitely work on. You're reminding me of a story I wrote almost a decade ago when I was at the Times on Digital Green, and it's the YouTube network for getting farmers to provide in local languages to provide insights for other farmers on better practices and the like. So that's not like a New York Times story, but it's a communication innovation that feels valuable. Lisa, a last go forth word from you. And thank you all again for being here.
Yeah, I guess I would just hopefully just to pick up on a lot of these things that I think it's important to remember that climate change, that we need to talk about it both from the impacts perspective as well as from the solutions, and that for many people, life is not great right now. Regardless of climate change, life is not great. Then climate change comes and acts as sort of impacts that even further. But we need to keep in mind that there are lots of other things that are driving also the conditions and preventing well-being, for example. But similarly, I think this notion that climate policy is not the only thing that affects climate change impact, so that we need to think more broadly about where we find the solutions. It's not just adaptation strategies, mitigation strategies. It's really this bigger picture around development and planning. And that is the case for all kinds of countries, not just in the global south. And I think maybe the final point is that I'm very thankful to see that the notion of climate justice is coming to the fore, and I have my little friend here, because climate justice offers the chance to spotlight a lot of these issues around equity and justice that are central to thinking about vulnerability. So even if we don't use that word vulnerability, maybe through this sort of the notion of climate justice, the equity issues, we can bring up a lot of these issues to demonstrate that there's such differential impacts of climate change and also of the solutions. I think that's what I would say for the end.
Thank you so much. And thank you to your daughter for showing her face, because so much of this is about the next generation as well. So thank you again today for being with me. This is the Sustain What webcast of Columbia University Climate School. I'm Andy Revkin. Please get in touch with ideas or reactions using the information in that little scrolling bar at the bottom. This show has been focused on Madagascar, which is locked in a terrible drought in the southern part of the country, the Grand Sud. But the issues here resonate everywhere. Everywhere in the world right now, there's someone who is down the street who is far more vulnerable than someone who's listening to this webcast. And finding ways to reduce that vulnerability on the path to building a better human relationship with the climate system is a key challenge and opportunity we can work on today, along with cutting emissions for the long haul benefits and thinking about where countries need more energy more than they need to focus on emissions. And that's something I wrote about in the context of the IPCC, the COP26. So thanks again to my guests, Lisa Schipper at Osgood, Martin van Alst, the director of the Climate Center for the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, who is an author of that new study showing that Madagascar's problems are much more about issues other than climate change. Denis Bariyanga, who's with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and Dan Osgood from Columbia's IRI, Center on Climate Change, Climate and Society. And go forth, follow up. Thank you again. Let's do this again sometime. And especially Denis, thank you for coming on from Madagascar, and good luck with all your work there. Take care, everybody.